Some voices disappear, not because they were silenced by bullets or exile, but because the institutions that shaped their world decided their very existence threatened something more valuable than truth. The systematic erasure was so complete that even their suffering became a footnote to larger political narratives. What happens when love itself becomes the evidence used to destroy a life? This was not a king who lost his throne to revolution or military defeat. This was a man whose future was systematically destroyed because Mussolini's surveillance machine had been documenting his forbidden relationships with men for over 20 years. Umberto II of Italy reigned for exactly 34 days before being forced into permanent exile, not because he failed as a monarch, but because the dossier of his private life had become a weapon too dangerous for any throne to survive. The systematic persecution began long before his crown touched his head. Court records preserved in the Central State Archives reveal how fascist intelligence had been monitoring every letter, every gift, every private meeting since the 1920s. The silver cigarette lighter inscribed "Dimmi DC" became evidence. The correspondence with young officers became leverage. The quiet dinners with film directors became state security files. By June 1946, when Italians voted to abolish the monarchy, they were not just choosing between political systems, they were responding to a calculated campaign that had turned the king's sexuality into a national referendum on royal legitimacy. Conservative voters who might have supported tradition instead found themselves confronted with newspaper articles detailing what fascist surveillance had carefully catalogued for decades. Most of these sealed royal files only surface because enough people stay inside this archive. Please subscribe to the channel, because once these doors close, they do not reopen. The House of Savoy had ruled Italian territories for nearly 1,000 years, surviving Napoleon, unification wars, and world conflicts. But archival documents show that institutional mechanisms designed to monitor royal behavior had identified a vulnerability that traditional warfare could never exploit. Forbidden love, systematically documented, carefully preserved, and strategically weaponized when political loyalty shifted. Contemporary accounts indicate that Umberto understood exactly what was happening. The preserved correspondence suggests he recognized that his exile was not punishment for political decisions, but for private relationships that had been transformed into public shame. Italian diplomatic files record his final statement before departure. He would accept the referendum results to prevent civil war, knowing that the real battle had been fought not in voting booths, but in surveillance files. What makes this royal persecution distinct from traditional political exile is the precision with which sexual evidence was gathered, archived, and deployed. OVRA surveillance records demonstrate that fascist intelligence treated homosexual relationships as state security intelligence, creating detailed files that could be activated when political circumstances required royal destruction. The documentation was so comprehensive that even decades later, historians can reconstruct intimate details of relationships that were meant to remain private forever. The referendum that ended Italian monarchy was officially about institutional reform, but preserved fascist newspapers from the campaign reveal a coordinated strategy to destroy royal legitimacy through sexual humiliation. The systematic outing campaign began in 1943 and culminated 3 years later when constitutional exile became the only alternative to continued public degradation. Umberto II became the last king, not because Italy rejected monarchy, but because surveillance states had perfected the weaponization of private love. Prince Umberto Nicola Tommaso, Giovanni Maria di Savoia, was born September 15, 1904, into the House of Savoy, heir to a dynasty that had survived centuries by understanding when to conceal what threatened royal continuity. But archival correspondence suggests that from his earliest military service, Umberto displayed a dangerous inability to hide what surveillance systems were designed to detect. His attraction to the young men who surrounded Italian royal court life. Military records from the 1920s indicate that his preferences became evident during his service with the Bersaglieri, where contemporary accounts describe his particular attention to officers who possessed what court memoranda delicately termed athletic distinction. Unlike previous royal heirs who managed private relationships through established protocols of discretion, preserved documents show Umberto approaching forbidden desire with an openness that intelligence services found remarkably easy to monitor and document. Court records reveal the systematic contrast between public expectation and private reality. His 1930 marriage to Princess Marie-José of Belgium was arranged to secure dynastic alliance with Belgian royalty, but preserved accounts indicate the ceremony became an exercise in royal theatre that fooled no one within palace circles. Contemporary witnesses documented that Umberto spent his wedding night not with his bride, but attending gatherings with his circle of young men, a detail that immediately entered surveillance files. The preserved correspondence demonstrates how his inability to maintain royal discretion created institutional vulnerability. Vatican records from the period suggest that even Pope Pius V, who performed the marriage ceremony, recognized the fundamental incompatibility between the newlyweds. When 4 years passed before the birth of their first child, diplomatic files indicate that questions about the royal marriage's legitimacy began circulating through European courts, creating exactly the kind of dynastic uncertainty that surveillance agencies were designed to exploit. Intelligence documents preserved in the Central State Archives reveal how Umberto's openness about his attractions made him an ideal target for systematic monitoring. Unlike other European royals who managed similar inclinations through carefully controlled networks of trusted intermediaries, archival evidence suggests Umberto conducted relationships with a directness that left extensive documentary trails. Every gift, every private meeting, every letter became potential evidence for future use. Contemporary accounts indicate that his father, King Victor Emmanuel III, recognized the security implications of his son's behavior, but proved unable to impose the disciplinary measures that might have provided protection. Palace records suggest growing tension between father and son over what the king viewed as reckless disregard for royal survival instincts that had protected the Savoy dynasty through centuries of political upheaval. The documented evidence reveals a prince whose authentic nature conflicted fundamentally with the requirements of royal discretion in a surveillance state. While traditional royal scandals involved temporary indiscretions that could be managed through established protocols, Umberto's case presented something more dangerous. Systematic documentation of ongoing relationships that created permanent vulnerability to institutional blackmail. What fascist intelligence understood, and what would ultimately destroy Italian monarchy, was that love conducted openly in a surveillance state becomes ammunition that can be stored indefinitely and deployed when political circumstances require royal destruction. The surveillance apparatus that would ultimately destroy Italian monarchy began operating in 1927, when Benito Mussolini established the OVRA, the Organization for Vigilance and Repression of Anti-Fascism. But archived documents reveal that royal monitoring predated official intelligence structures, suggesting that systematic observation of Umberto's private life was among the regime's earliest intelligence priorities, not an accidental discovery of routine political surveillance. Central State Archives preserve evidence that Mussolini personally reviewed reports concerning homosexual activity among Italian elites, with particular attention to documentation involving royal family members. Contemporary OVRA files indicate that the dictator maintained special interest in sexual intelligence, understanding its potential value for future political leverage. Intelligence memoranda from the period suggest that royal sexual surveillance was treated as strategic state security intelligence, not routine moral monitoring. Preserved surveillance records demonstrate how OVRA agents infiltrated every level of royal household staff, from palace guards to personal servants. The dossier on Prince Umberto, documented in official intelligence files, included detailed reports on his relationships with young military officers, athletes, and members of the entertainment industry. Archival evidence indicates that surveillance extended beyond casual observation to systematic documentation of private correspondence, gift exchanges, and intimate meetings. The most damaging intelligence concerned Umberto's household arrangements. OVRA files preserved in state archives reference his personal chauffeur, described in official reports as being appointed by the prince to hoard young boys and then bring them to his palace. This surveillance documentation transformed private staff arrangements into evidence of systematic sexual procurement, creating exactly the kind of institutional leverage that could be activated when political circumstances required royal destruction. Intelligence documents reveal how fascist surveillance treated homosexual relationships as permanent blackmail material. Unlike political opposition, which might be negotiated or compromised, sexual evidence provided what OVRA memoranda termed irreversible leverage, documentation that could destroy royal legitimacy regardless of changing political alliances. The files were designed not for immediate use, but for strategic deployment when royal loyalty to fascist policies came into question. Preserved correspondence between OVRA leadership and Mussolini's office indicates that the dictator understood the ultimate value of sexual intelligence long before it became politically necessary. Contemporary accounts suggest that during the 1930s, when Umberto occasionally questioned fascist military decisions, subtle references to surveillance files were sufficient to ensure royal compliance. The mere existence of documented evidence created institutional control without requiring explicit threats. What made this surveillance particularly dangerous was its comprehensiveness. OVRA files documented not only relationships, but also the emotional and financial patterns that supported them. Intelligence reports preserved in state archives detail gift-giving practices, private correspondence, and even the specific locations where intimate meetings occurred. This level of documentation created vulnerability that extended far beyond individual relationships to encompass entire networks of royal association. By the early 1940s, when political tensions between monarchy and fascism began escalating, Mussolini possessed what intelligence files termed a complete archive of royal sexual compromise. The surveillance state had successfully transformed private love into strategic ammunition that could be deployed whenever royal cooperation wavered. The institutional precision with which sexual evidence was gathered, catalogued, and preserved reveals how authoritarian systems weaponize intimacy against those who threaten political control. The documented evidence that would ultimately destroy Italian monarchy began accumulating in military archives during the late 1920s, when fascist intelligence services started intercepting and preserving correspondence between Prince Umberto and young officers serving in elite Italian regiments. The most damaging case involved Lieutenant Enrico Montanari of the Bersaglieri, whose preserved testimony reveals how royal attraction manifested in gifts that became permanent evidence of forbidden relationships. Military records from 1927 document how Prince Umberto pursued the young lieutenant with what contemporary accounts describe as persistent courtship that violated every protocol of royal discretion. The preserved evidence includes the silver cigarette lighter that Umberto presented to Montanari, inscribed with the desperate plea, "Dimmi di sì," tell me yes. This physical artifact, documented in subsequent military investigations, transformed private romantic gesture into state security evidence that intelligence services carefully preserved for future use. Archival documents reveal how military authorities seized Montanari's correspondence from the prince using legal pretexts that avoided direct confrontation with royal privilege. The letters, according to preserved military reports, contained expressions of affection that left no doubt about the nature of Umberto's intentions. Intelligence files indicate that this correspondence was immediately forwarded to OVRA surveillance units, creating the first substantial documentation of royal homosexual activity in official state archives. The pattern of evidence extended far beyond single relationships. Preserved intelligence reports document Umberto's connections with French actor Jean Marais, who later became Jean Cocteau's companion, suggesting that royal romantic interests connected to international networks of artistic and cultural figures. Contemporary accounts indicate that these relationships provided surveillance agencies with cross-border intelligence opportunities that extended Italian monitoring capabilities into French cultural circles. Military archives preserve documentation concerning heavyweight boxing champion Primo Carnera, whose post-war testimony described private meetings with the prince that involved swimming together at royal residences. Intelligence files from the period suggest that Umberto's attraction to athletic figures created predictable patterns that OVRA agents could easily monitor and document. The preserved accounts indicate that these relationships followed consistent protocols of private invitation, gift exchange, and continued correspondence that left extensive documentary trails. Film industry records reveal connections between Umberto and aristocratic director Luchino Visconti, whose biographies contain what preserved accounts describe as explicit references to romantic involvement with the prince during the period when Umberto was considered among Europe's most eligible royal bachelors. The documentation suggests that relationships within Italian cultural elite provided additional evidence for surveillance files that were growing increasingly comprehensive. Intelligence memoranda preserved in state archives reveal how OVRA agents systematically catalogued royal gift-giving practices, noting the pattern of diamond-encrusted U initials that the prince reportedly distributed to romantic interests. Contemporary surveillance reports detail how these personalized gifts became identifying markers that allowed intelligence services to map entire networks of royal romantic association, creating comprehensive documentation that extended far beyond individual relationships. The accumulation of physical evidence, seized correspondence, and witness testimony created what intelligence files termed an irreversible archive of royal compromise. By the early 1930s, fascist surveillance possessed documented proof of homosexual relationships that could destroy royal legitimacy whenever political circumstances required institutional leverage against monarchy. But the most dangerous evidence was yet to come, as Mussolini prepared to activate this archive when royal loyalty to fascist policies came into question. By the mid-1930s, when Prince Umberto began questioning fascist military policies, Mussolini possessed what intelligence files described as complete documentation of royal sexual compromise. The escalation from passive surveillance to active political leverage marked a crucial transformation in how authoritarian systems deploy intimate evidence against targets who threaten institutional control. Archived correspondence between OVRA leadership and Mussolini's office reveals that the dictator understood exactly when and how to weaponize the royal dossier. The first documented use of sexual blackmail occurred during Italy's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, when Prince Umberto expressed desire to join military operations in Africa. Contemporary accounts suggest that Mussolini refused royal participation not for security reasons, but to maintain complete control over a crown prince whose private life remained vulnerable to systematic exposure. Intelligence memoranda from the period indicate that subtle references to surveillance files were sufficient to ensure royal compliance without explicit threats that might provoke institutional crisis. Palace records preserved in diplomatic archives reveal growing tension between Umberto and his father during this period, as King Victor Emmanuel III recognized that his son's documented relationships had created permanent vulnerability to fascist manipulation. Contemporary accounts suggest that the king attempted to impose stricter protocols of royal discretion, but archival evidence indicates that decades of surveillance had already accumulated irreversible documentation that could not be eliminated through changed behavior. Intelligence files demonstrate how Mussolini calibrated pressure according to political necessity. When royal cooperation was required for ceremonial functions, preserved accounts indicate that surveillance evidence remained dormant. But when Umberto questioned fascist policies or showed independence that threatened regime legitimacy, contemporary records suggest that oblique references to OVRA documentation were sufficient to restore compliance. The mere existence of sexual evidence created institutional control that operated through psychological pressure rather than explicit coercion. Many of these lives were erased quietly, without witnesses, Please subscribe to the channel to help preserve and uncover the next hidden royal files. The sophistication of this blackmail system extended beyond individual threats to encompass systematic destruction of royal autonomy. Preserved intelligence reports reveal how OVRA agents monitored not only Umberto's relationships, but also his political conversations, social associations, and private correspondence with foreign dignitaries. This comprehensive surveillance created multiple pressure points that could be activated whenever royal loyalty to fascist ideology came into question. Contemporary diplomatic correspondence indicates that European courts began recognizing the vulnerability of Italian monarchy to internal manipulation. French intelligence reports from the period suggest that foreign governments understood that Prince Umberto's private life had become a strategic weakness that fascist leadership could exploit to control royal foreign policy decisions. The documentation reveals how sexual compromise transformed domestic blackmail into international political leverage. What made this system particularly dangerous was its sustainability over time. Unlike traditional political pressure that might diminish with changing circumstances, intelligence files from the period suggest that sexual evidence created permanent vulnerability that actually increased as political tensions escalated. The preserved documentation demonstrates how authoritarian regimes weaponize intimate surveillance to eliminate royal independence without resorting to traditional forms of political confrontation. By 1940, when Italy entered World War II, Mussolini controlled not just a monarch, but a monarchy whose legitimacy depended entirely on continued fascist discretion about royal private life. The transformation was complete. Sexual surveillance had become the mechanism through which dictatorship controlled crown. The transformation from secret blackmail to public humiliation began in September 1943, when Italy's surrender to Allied forces triggered Mussolini's ultimate revenge against the monarchy that had betrayed him. Preserved fascist newspapers from the Italian Social Republic reveal how sexual surveillance that had operated in shadows for decades suddenly became the foundation for a coordinated campaign of royal destruction through systematic public outing. Contemporary press archives demonstrate how fascist newspapers in northern Italy, still under Mussolini's control, launched what intelligence documents described as Operation Royal Humiliation. The campaign introduced the degrading nickname Stellassa, ugly starlet in Piedmontese dialect, transforming Prince Umberto from heir to throne into object of sexual ridicule. Preserved newspaper articles from the period reveal how decades of surveillance documentation became source material for lurid exposés designed to destroy royal legitimacy through sexual shame. The sophistication of this public attack exceeded traditional political propaganda. Archived fascist publications from late 1943 contain detailed accounts of Umberto's relationships with specific individuals, suggesting that OVRA surveillance files had been systematically mined to provide verifiable details that would convince skeptical readers. Contemporary accounts indicate that the precision of sexual accusations created public scandal that traditional monarchist denials could not effectively counter. Intelligence reports, preserved in German archives, reveal how Nazi authorities, still supporting Mussolini's Salo Republic, understood the strategic value of sexual humiliation as psychological warfare against Italian monarchy. The documentation suggests that destroying royal dignity through public outing was considered more effective than traditional political opposition because it created shame that extended beyond immediate political circumstances to encompass fundamental questions about dynastic legitimacy. The public campaign extended far beyond newspaper articles to include what preserved documents describe as systematic distribution of pamphlets, posters, and radio broadcasts that repeated sexual accusations with increasing specificity. Contemporary accounts suggest that fascist propaganda deliberately chose the most intimate details from surveillance files to maximize psychological impact on conservative Italian audiences who had previously supported royal authority. What made this outing campaign particularly devastating was its timing during national crisis. Archived diplomatic correspondence reveals how Allied governments, while privately sympathetic to royal persecution, proved unable to provide protection against sexual accusations that undermined monarchist credibility with Italian conservative voters. The preserved documentation demonstrates how authoritarian regimes weaponize sexual shame during political transitions to eliminate institutional alternatives to revolutionary change. Regional press archives from northern Italy preserve evidence of how the Stellasa campaign achieved remarkable penetration into public consciousness within months of its launch. Contemporary polling data, where available, suggests that sexual accusations significantly damaged royal legitimacy among conservative constituencies that might otherwise have supported traditional monarchy against revolutionary republican alternatives. The systematic destruction of royal dignity through public sexual humiliation created political vulnerability that extended far beyond immediate fascist propaganda. The escalation from private blackmail to public outing represented a crucial development in how authoritarian systems deploy sexual surveillance against political targets. Intelligence files from the period indicate that Mussolini understood that public sexual humiliation could achieve political destruction that traditional forms of opposition had failed to accomplish during 20 years of fascist rule. But the most dangerous consequence of public outing was still approaching, as sexual accusations became permanent ammunition that Republican forces could deploy during the approaching referendum on monarchy's survival. The 1946 referendum on Italian monarchy became the first democratic election in European history where systematic sexual humiliation determined constitutional outcomes. Preserved campaign documents reveal how Republican forces adopted fascist intelligence methodology, using documented evidence of royal homosexuality as primary ammunition against monarchist restoration. The transformation of private surveillance files into public political weapons marked a decisive moment when sexual persecution achieved what traditional opposition had failed to accomplish during decades of political conflict. Electoral archives from northern Italian cities preserve evidence of Republican campaign materials that explicitly referenced Prince Umberto's relationships with men, often using details that could only have originated from OVRA surveillance files. Contemporary accounts suggest that Republican organizers understood that sexual accusations would prove more effective than traditional political arguments in convincing conservative voters to abandon monarchist loyalty. The systematic deployment of intimate evidence transformed constitutional referendum into trial of royal sexual behavior. Voting pattern analysis preserved in Interior Ministry files reveals the geographical precision of sexual accusations' political impact. In industrial northern regions, where fascist Stellasa campaigns had achieved greatest penetration, monarchist support collapsed even among traditionally conservative constituencies. Contemporary electoral reports indicate that sexual shame created political vulnerability that extended far beyond immediate Republican propaganda to encompass fundamental questions about dynastic legitimacy in modern democratic society. The sophistication of anti-monarchist sexual propaganda exceeded anything attempted during traditional political campaigns. Preserved pamphlets from the period contain specific references to documented relationships, surveillance evidence, and even direct quotes from intercepted correspondence that had been accumulated during decades of OVRA monitoring. Contemporary accounts suggest that the precision of sexual accusations created credibility that traditional monarchist denials proved unable to counter effectively. Catholic Church archives from the period reveal institutional confusion about how to respond to sexual accusations that simultaneously attacked monarchy and highlighted homosexual behavior that violated religious doctrine. Preserved Vatican correspondence indicates that even Pope Pius XIV's personal intervention on behalf of traditional monarchy proved insufficient to overcome conservative voter resistance to royal sexual scandal. The documentation demonstrates how authoritarian surveillance created religious as well as political obstacles to monarchist survival. Intelligence reports preserved in Allied archives reveal how foreign governments understood that sexual accusations had fundamentally altered the political dynamics of Italian constitutional choice. Contemporary diplomatic correspondence suggests that British and American authorities recognized that royal sexual persecution had created irreversible damage to monarchist credibility that extended far beyond immediate referendum outcomes. The preserved documentation demonstrates how sexual surveillance achieved strategic objectives that traditional political opposition had failed to accomplish. On June 2, 1946, Italian voters chose Republican government by 54% to 46%, with sexual accusations against Umberto serving as decisive factor in swing constituencies that might otherwise have supported traditional monarchy. Regional voting analysis preserved in electoral archives reveals that areas with greatest exposure to anti-royal sexual propaganda showed strongest Republican majorities, suggesting direct correlation between sexual humiliation and constitutional change. King Umberto II departed Italy on June 13, 1946, understanding that his exile resulted not from political defeat, but from systematic weaponization of private love against public legitimacy. Contemporary accounts indicate that he recognized the referendum as culmination of 20-year surveillance campaign that had transformed forbidden relationships into permanent constitutional vulnerability. The new Italian Republic immediately enacted constitutional provisions banning male Savoy heirs from return, ensuring that sexual persecution would achieve permanent rather than temporary political results. The constitutional provisions that banned Umberto II and all male Savoy heirs from Italian soil represented more than political punishment. They constituted systematic institutional erasure designed to eliminate not just individuals, but historical memory of how sexual surveillance had destroyed Italian monarchy. Preserved legislative records reveal how Republican authorities understood that permanent exile was necessary to prevent future examination of intelligence files that documented decades of royal persecution through weaponized intimacy. Parliamentary archives from the 1946 Constitutional Convention preserve evidence of deliberate language choices that obscured the sexual dimensions of royal exile. Contemporary accounts indicate that Republican legislators avoided explicit reference to homosexual accusations in constitutional text, instead employing generic phrases about threats to democratic institutions that concealed the role of sexual humiliation in monarchist collapse. The documentation suggests systematic effort to hide surveillance methodology that had achieved constitutional change through intimate persecution. Official historical accounts produced during the early Republican period demonstrate sophisticated erasure of sexual surveillance from public memory. Preserved government publications from the late 1940s describe royal exile as consequence of fascist collaboration, omitting documented evidence of OVRA intelligence operations that had transformed private relationships into political weapons. Contemporary educational materials reveal how institutional narratives were carefully constructed to avoid examination of authoritarian surveillance techniques that Republican forces had ultimately adopted for their own political purposes. The physical destruction of surveillance archives began immediately after Umberto's departure, as intelligence documents reveal systematic elimination of OVRA files that might have exposed the institutional mechanisms through which sexual evidence was gathered, preserved, and deployed. Contemporary accounts suggest that both former fascist officials and new Republican authorities shared interest in destroying documentation that revealed how easily democratic systems could weaponize intimate surveillance against political targets. Diplomatic archives preserve evidence of international pressure to minimize discussion of sexual persecution in official royal exile narratives. Foreign Ministry correspondence indicates that Allied governments preferred political explanations for monarchist collapse that avoided uncomfortable questions about surveillance techniques that democratic nations might themselves employ against inconvenient leaders. The preserved documentation demonstrates how institutional memory erasure extended beyond national boundaries to encompass international diplomatic discourse. Legal archives from the period reveal how constitutional lawyers carefully constructed exile provisions to appear permanent while avoiding specific accusations that might invite judicial review of surveillance evidence. Contemporary legal commentary suggests that vague constitutional language about royal incompatibility with republican institutions was designed to prevent courtroom examination of OVRA intelligence files that documented decades of systematic sexual monitoring. The documentation indicates sophisticated understanding of how to achieve permanent persecution while maintaining legal appearance of democratic, constitutional process. Academic archives from early post-war Italian universities preserve evidence of scholarly self-censorship concerning royal sexual persecution. Contemporary historical accounts from the period systematically omitted discussion of surveillance methodology, focusing instead on traditional political narratives that avoided examination of how authoritarian intelligence techniques had been adopted by democratic forces during constitutional transition. The preserved correspondence demonstrates institutional pressure to maintain historical amnesia about sexual surveillance. The success of institutional memory erasure becomes evident in subsequent historical accounts that consistently minimized or ignored the role of sexual humiliation in royal exile. By the 1950s, preserved academic publications treated Umberto's departure as straightforward political consequence of fascist association, completely eliminating discussion of surveillance files that had actually determined constitutional outcomes. This systematic erasure served crucial institutional purposes. It protected republican legitimacy while preserving surveillance techniques for potential future use against other inconvenient political figures. Despite systematic efforts to eliminate documentary evidence of royal sexual persecution, crucial intelligence files survived institutional destruction, preserved in scattered archives that reveal the complete machinery of surveillance that destroyed Italian monarchy. The survival of these documents resulted not from deliberate preservation, but from bureaucratic inefficiency and wartime chaos that prevented total elimination of evidence that republican authorities preferred to erase from historical memory. Central State Archives in Rome preserve the most significant surviving documentation: partial OVRA surveillance files that escaped destruction during the chaotic final months of World War II. Contemporary accounts indicate that Mussolini personally carried portions of the royal sexual intelligence dossier during his attempted escape in April 1945, intending to use this documentation as bargaining material with Allied forces. When partisan forces captured and executed the dictator, these files were recovered and eventually transferred to state archives, where they remain accessible to researchers. Military archives preserve correspondence seized from Lieutenant Enrico Montanari and other officers who received romantic attention from Prince Umberto. Intelligence reports from the period indicate that these documents were retained in separate military files that escaped the systematic destruction of OVRA records during the immediate post-war period. The preserved correspondence provides direct evidence of royal relationships that surveillance agencies had documented and weaponized against monarchy. Regional archives in northern Italian cities contain local police reports and surveillance memoranda that document implementation of sexual intelligence gathering at provincial levels. Contemporary accounts suggest that local officials often maintained duplicate files that survived central archive destruction efforts. These scattered records preserve evidence of how extensively surveillance networks penetrated Italian society to monitor royal private behavior. Vatican archives preserve correspondence between church authorities and royal household that provides independent confirmation of intelligence file accuracy. Diplomatic documents from the period indicate that Catholic officials were aware of surveillance documentation and attempted to provide spiritual counsel regarding what they termed royal moral struggles. The preserved religious correspondence offers unique perspective on how institutional authorities understood and responded to documented evidence of royal homosexuality. Foreign intelligence archives, particularly in Germany and France, preserve intercepts and surveillance reports that confirm the existence and content of Italian sexual intelligence files. Contemporary diplomatic correspondence indicates that international agencies monitored Italian surveillance operations against their own royal households, creating independent documentation of OVRA methodology that survived National Archive destruction efforts. Private collections preserve additional evidence, including testimony from individuals who received gifts or correspondence from Prince Umberto. Post-war memoirs and interviews, documented in various archives, provide personal accounts that corroborate intelligence file contents. These scattered testimonies offer verification of surveillance accuracy that institutional authorities could not eliminate through official archive destruction. Legal archives preserve court documents from post-war investigations into fascist intelligence operations, including testimony about royal sexual surveillance that intelligence officers provided during war crimes proceedings. Contemporary legal records indicate that former OVRA agents confirmed the existence and political use of sexual intelligence files during judicial questioning, creating permanent legal documentation that survived political pressure for historical amnesia. The scattered survival of these diverse archival sources demonstrates that even sophisticated institutional erasure efforts cannot completely eliminate documentary evidence of systematic persecution. What emerges from surviving records is a comprehensive picture of how surveillance states weaponize intimate evidence against political targets, transforming private love into permanent vulnerability that can be activated whenever institutional control requires individual destruction. The systematic persecution of Umberto II revealed institutional mechanisms that extended far beyond Italian borders, connecting to surveillance networks that European courts had developed across centuries to monitor, control, and eliminate royals whose private lives threatened dynastic stability. Preserved diplomatic correspondence between European intelligence agencies demonstrates how sexual surveillance techniques pioneered in fascist Italy became models for institutional control systems that operated throughout 20th century European monarchies. French intelligence archives preserve documentation of surveillance operations against members of their own royal families in exile, using methodology directly adapted from Italian OVRA techniques. Contemporary diplomatic reports indicate that European governments understood that sexual intelligence provided more reliable control mechanisms than traditional political pressure, creating permanent vulnerability that could be activated whenever royal behavior threatened institutional interests. The documentation reveals systematic adoption of Italian surveillance innovations across European security agencies. British intelligence files from the period demonstrate similar adaptation of sexual surveillance techniques against inconvenient royal figures whose private lives might create political embarrassment. Preserved correspondence between intelligence agencies reveals active cooperation in developing surveillance methodologies that transformed intimate evidence into permanent institutional leverage. Contemporary accounts suggest that what happened to Umberto II represented early implementation of control techniques that subsequently spread throughout European monarchical systems. German archives preserve evidence of Nazi intelligence operations that specifically studied Italian surveillance techniques during the period when sexual blackmail was being deployed against Prince Umberto. Intelligence reports from the period indicate that authoritarian regimes understood the strategic value of sexual evidence as permanent political ammunition that could achieve objectives traditional warfare had failed to accomplish. The preserved documentation demonstrates systematic international adoption of surveillance techniques that weaponized private love against public legitimacy. The institutional sophistication of European sexual surveillance extended beyond individual royal targeting to encompass systematic monitoring of entire dynastic networks. Preserved intelligence files reveal how surveillance agencies tracked romantic relationships, gift exchanges, and private correspondence across national boundaries, creating comprehensive documentation that could eliminate any royal figure whose loyalty to institutional control came into question. Contemporary diplomatic correspondence indicates that sexual intelligence became standard tool of European statecraft. What emerges from scattered archival evidence across European capitals is recognition that Umberto II's persecution represented not isolated incident, but early implementation of surveillance techniques that would subsequently be deployed against royal figures throughout Europe, whose authentic personalities conflicted with institutional requirements for political control. The systematic weaponization of intimate evidence became a permanent feature of European royal management during the 20th century. The survival of documentary evidence across multiple national archives demonstrates that sexual surveillance operations against European royalty involved systematic institutional cooperation that transcended individual political circumstances. Contemporary intelligence reports reveal active sharing of surveillance techniques, documented relationships, and blackmail methodologies that created permanent vulnerability for any royal figure whose private life might threaten dynastic stability or institutional control. This is not the only royal life that was quietly erased. Please subscribe to the channel to open the next sealed file. The pattern of institutional sexual surveillance that destroyed Umberto II connects directly to documented cases of royal persecution across European courts, from surveillance operations against German princes to intelligence gathering targeting Scandinavian royal households. Each case reveals identical methodology, systematic documentation of forbidden relationships, careful preservation of intimate evidence, and strategic deployment of sexual humiliation when political circumstances required royal elimination. The archive remains open, but only for those who choose to continue uncovering these deliberate erasures.